Hey everyone! Tonight, we're going to pull back the thick, embroidered curtain of medieval history and look into a space often wrapped in secrecy and quiet rumor, the king's bedchamber. For now, set aside the grand tournaments, heroic knights, and holy crusades. We're moving past the public image of the monarch and into a world where power was not only carried by a crown or scepter, but shaped in the most private rooms of the castle. Picture yourself inside a vast, cold stone hall. The air is heavy with the smell of beeswax and aged wood. At one end sits the throne, a clear symbol of authority. Yet what we're really examining is how the fate of a kingdom, the survival of a dynasty, and the lives of countless people could depend on what happened in a smaller, quieter room just steps away. This was a place where love, desire, politics, and authority became tightly bound together, often producing outcomes far from simple. You may be surprised by what truly happened behind those castle walls. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. Now, lower the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's ease into this journey together. You're standing at the meeting point of throne room and bedchamber, where public duty and private life were not merely connected, they were inseparable. To be a medieval king was to represent the state itself. His body symbolized the body of the kingdom, and his most personal actions, especially those involving sex, carried major political weight. A well-established historical fact is that a king's ability to produce a legitimate male heir was not just a personal concern. It was a matter of national security. The system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the throne, formed the foundation of royal stability. If a king failed to produce a son, the entire realm risked being drawn into violent succession disputes. No ruler wanted that burden on his legacy. This explains why a king's virility, or the lack of it, was never just idle gossip. It was an urgent issue of state. Imagine the pressure involved. Every visit to the bedchamber was not only an intimate moment with the queen, but a calculated act meant to secure the future of the dynasty. Each morning, the court waited anxiously for any hint, any rumor, that the kingdom's future was becoming more secure. It's almost like a corporate merger where success is measured by whether the executives produce an heir, and failure could destroy the entire organization. That's an extraordinary amount of pressure for one room. An interesting and often overlooked detail from this era involves the royal bed itself. It was far more than furniture. It represented authority and fertility. Historical accounts describe blessings and rituals performed on royal beds to encourage conception. In some cases, a king and queen were even required to consummate their marriage in front of witnesses, proving its legitimacy and the possibility of an heir. Privacy was minimal. It resembled a public examination more than a romantic beginning. And suddenly, awkward family visits don't seem so bad. This intense focus on heirs created a clear and often troubling double standard. Queens were expected to embody purity, devotion, and motherhood, their role limited almost entirely to producing legitimate children. Kings, however, were given far more freedom. Their affairs, mistresses, and illegitimate children were frequently tolerated, and sometimes even accepted as proof of masculine strength. It was considered part of ruling. In modern terms, it's almost like excusing personal misconduct as long as professional results are delivered. Historians continue to debate whether the many stories of royal excess and strange practices found in medieval chronicles should be taken literally or viewed as exaggerated moral commentary. These records were often written by monks or political rivals, each with their own motives. Separating truth from rumor is difficult. It's similar to trying to write history using only celebrity tabloids. You get scandal, but not always accuracy. So as torchlight flickers against the heavy curtains of the bedchamber, it becomes clear that this private space was anything but secluded. It functioned as a stage for political tension, a source of widespread anxiety, and a place where the fate of nations was quietly, and sometimes oddly, decided. The next time you see an image of a medieval king, remember that his authority was not limited to the battlefield or throne. It extended into his bed. The chamber now seems brighter, not with warmth or affection, but with the cold pressure of governance. We've established that the king's body was a political tool, but it was the queen's body that carried the heaviest burden. Your attention naturally turns to her. A woman often brought from a distant court and placed into a foreign land with one overriding duty: to produce a legitimate male heir. The foundation of medieval succession rested on primogeniture, the widely accepted principle that the king's eldest son would inherit the throne. While simple in theory, this system was essential for preventing civil war and disputed claims. Without a clear male heir, rival factions could tear a kingdom apart, sometimes for generations. Because of this, a queen's primary role was rarely companionship or counsel. She was valued mainly as the bearer of the dynasty's future. Her worth was tied to fertility, and more specifically, her ability to give birth to a son. Imagine being that queen, young, far from home, and under constant observation. Every meal, every prayer, and every moment spent with the king in the bedchamber was monitored with intense political interest. You were no longer just an individual. You were the most critical piece on the political chessboard. Your success or failure would shape history, deciding whether your bloodline endured or disappeared. It's like an extreme version of reality television, where the prize is an entire kingdom and the only challenge is producing a male heir. When a queen gave birth to a son, she was honored, protected, and her position at court became secure. But if she produced only daughters or failed to conceive at all, the tension grew overwhelming. Anxiety filled every corridor of the castle. The king, the nobility, and the public were all watching closely. This was nothing like modern celebrations around childbirth. It was centuries of national fear concentrated into one royal womb. A lesser-known detail from these courts shows just how far people were willing to go to ensure the birth of a male heir. Beyond formal prayer, medieval courts relied heavily on folk beliefs and unusual practices. Many people believed that specific positions during intercourse could determine a child's gender. Others commissioned special amulets or sacred relics, often containing fragments of saints' bones, which were placed near the queen's bed in hopes of divine assistance in producing a male heir. Some of the strangest efforts involved giving the queen mixtures of dried herbs, ground bone, and other peculiar ingredients to drink, usually on the advice of a court magician or a physician with questionable credentials. This resembled folklore more than medicine, closer to an improvised potion than scientific treatment. Yet when the future of a kingdom depended on a single outcome, every option was considered worth trying. The intense emphasis on male heirs, and the corresponding dismissal of female succession, was a defining feature of this era. Historians continue to debate whether this focus represented a rational political calculation, a practical attempt to prevent civil war, or simply a reflection of a deeply embedded patriarchal system that refused to recognize a woman's right to rule independently. Was it strategic necessity or cultural prejudice? Most likely, it was an uneasy mixture of both, a tangled intersection of power, tradition, and gender that resisted simple explanations. This relentless pressure on queens to bear sons fueled many of the most extreme and controversial behaviors of medieval kings. It drove their pursuit of mistresses and their desperate attempts to annul marriages. When a queen's body failed to meet expectations, kings often sought alternative, and frequently unconventional, solutions to preserve their bloodline. It was an urgent problem that could not be resolved through warfare or diplomacy, and the search for answers sometimes led into troubling territory. As the overwhelming pressure placed on queens becomes clearer, it becomes easier to understand why a king's attention might drift elsewhere. When a queen appeared infertile, or when a political marriage lacked emotional connection, kings often looked beyond their marriages for comfort and companionship. This leads directly to the influential and often hidden world of concubines and mistresses, a realm governed by unwritten rules and quiet power struggles that existed alongside the formal court. The distinction between queen and mistress was sharp and fundamental to medieval society. The queen was a political instrument, a dynastic partner whose primary role was to produce legitimate heirs. Her position was public, ceremonial, and sanctified by the church. A mistress, in contrast, occupied a private role. She was a personal companion, often involved in an intimate relationship with the king, and sometimes deeply loved. However, any children she bore, regardless of the king's affection for them, were deemed illegitimate and excluded from the line of succession. This created a painful contradiction. A king might cherish his mistress and their children, yet they remained permanently outside the formal structure of royal inheritance. The appeal of a mistress was complex. She offered relief from the constant political demands of kingship, a space where the king could exist as a man rather than a ruler. Royal marriages were political alliances, rarely based on affection, and emotional fulfillment was often sought elsewhere. A mistress could also provide offspring when a queen could not, though those children carried no dynastic weight. In this sense, the mistress functioned as a personal outlet, allowing the king to satisfy private needs without destabilizing the official marriage. For queens, this arrangement was deeply uncomfortable and humiliating. Many were forced to accept the mistress's presence at court, sometimes even interacting with her publicly. A queen's authority derived from her title and her legitimate children, not from her husband's loyalty. Open jealousy could be interpreted as weakness and political vulnerability, so queens were expected to endure these situations with composed dignity. The tension this created was constant, an unspoken drama that lingered behind closed doors. One lesser-known detail from this period is the French term maîtresse en titre, a title that appeared later but had medieval roots. This referred to an official mistress, a woman who was publicly recognized, given her own residence at court, and formally included in the royal hierarchy. The existence of such a role demonstrates how normalized and structured royal infidelity could become. It was an institutional solution to a personal issue, one that blended private relationships with public power. Historians still debate whether the role of the mistress weakened monarchies or served as a stabilizing outlet. Did attention given to an unofficial family undermine the authority of the legitimate one? Or did it allow kings to manage personal desires without threatening politically necessary marriages? The outcome often depended on the personalities involved, the queen's strength, and the political skill of the mistress. As you imagine the distant sound of a lute, perhaps mourning a queen's quiet suffering or celebrating a mistress's rise, it becomes clear that the medieval court was shaped by competing loyalties and desires. Despite her formal authority, the queen was often sidelined within her own marriage. You've now seen the basic divide between queen and mistress, one a public symbol of dynastic power, the other a private source of comfort. Yet this division was rarely absolute. Although a mistress lacked a crown, she could, through intelligence and strategic behavior, gain influence equal to or even greater than that of the queen. This leads to a frequently overlooked aspect of medieval politics: the political authority of the royal mistress. While her position was inherently unstable, it offered a powerful channel of influence. Historical records show that because of her intimate access to the king, a mistress could become a trusted confidant, advisor, and gatekeeper. The queen's interactions with the king were often formal, while the mistresses were private and unguarded. In these moments, kings shared concerns, frustrations, and political uncertainties they might never reveal elsewhere. In effect, the mistress's chamber became a secondary center of power, where decisions were shaped away from public scrutiny. Courtiers understood this dynamic well. To reach the king, they often sought the mistress first, offering gifts, favors, or promises of wealth in exchange for her support. She became an unofficial broker of influence, a vital yet informal part of the political system. However, this influence came with serious risk. A mistress's power depended entirely on the king's favor, and without it, her position could vanish as quickly as it appeared. If he grew bored of her, discovered a new favorite, or felt offended in any way, her influence and wealth could disappear almost instantly. She held no official rank, had no legal safeguards, and possessed no real security beyond the king's personal favor. For her, it was a high-risk arrangement, yet one that many women were willing to accept. One lesser-known detail from this period is the role certain influential mistresses played in supporting the arts. Beyond political influence, some royal mistresses used their access to power to become patrons of poets, musicians, and artists, leaving a noticeable mark on court culture. They commissioned artworks, supported troubadours, and cultivated a refined, stylish cultural space that contrasted with the queen's more formal and restrained court environment. In modern terms, it resembles a powerful executive's partner funding independent creative projects, except in this case, The result was medieval poetry rather than film. Historians continue to debate whether a mistress's influence tended to stabilize or disrupt royal governance. Did she offer candid advice that helped the king govern more effectively? Or did she advance her own interests and those of her relatives, encouraging rivalries that endangered political unity? The reality depended largely on the individual. Some mistresses acted with restraint and intelligence, while others were driven by ambition and greed. Their influence could therefore be beneficial or harmful, often at the same time. As you move beyond the private quarters of the mistress, it becomes clear that the medieval court operated through a complex blend of official authority and informal influence. Ironically, the woman without a crown often wielded remarkable power. This leads directly to the most lasting and visible consequence of a king's extramarital relationships: the children born from them. These individuals occupied a particularly unusual and complicated position in medieval society. While a royal mistress might enjoy temporary influence, her power was fragile and dependent on the king's changing affections. Her most enduring legacy, however, was the children she bore. As rumors surrounded the king's relationships, the court also filled with the presence of his illegitimate sons and daughters. These individuals lived in a deeply paradoxical position. They possessed royal blood, yet carried a permanent legal and social disadvantage. Their status was complex and well documented in historical records, representing both opportunity and limitation. On one hand, they were acknowledged as the offspring of the most powerful man in the realm. Many received titles, extensive lands, and advantageous marriages into noble families, strengthening political alliances. In some cases, they enjoyed greater privilege than the legitimate children of lesser nobles, demonstrating the enduring power of royal lineage, even when legally flawed. On the other hand, they were permanently barred from the ultimate prize, the throne. The laws of primogeniture were absolute. Regardless of talent, popularity, or service, an illegitimate child could never inherit the crown. This produced a life defined by exceptional privilege paired with an unbreakable ceiling. One might become a duke, a general, or even a high church official, but never king. It was access without entitlement. For the king, these children served an important political function. They formed a loyal support network whose fortunes depended entirely on his favor. He could place them in positions of authority, trusting them more than independent nobles who might harbor their own ambitions. They became military leaders, administrators, and trusted agents in a political environment defined by rivalry and suspicion. In medieval England, many of these children carried the surname Fitzroy, meaning son of the king. This name publicly acknowledged their lineage while simultaneously marking their illegitimacy. It elevated their status but reinforced their exclusion. It was recognition and limitation combined into a single title. This formal labeling reflects a society determined to manage and categorize a potentially destabilizing reality. By assigning these individuals a defined place, medieval rulers transformed a potential source of disorder into a usable political tool. Historians have long debated the inner lives of these children. Did they feel loyalty toward the father who granted them power and privilege? Or did resentment grow from the knowledge of what they could never claim? Some remained steadfast allies, while others became rivals to their legitimate half-siblings. Their royal blood was both an asset and a persistent source of tension. Their lives illustrate the contradictions of medieval rule. They embodied both the king's authority and the queen's political vulnerability. They lived amid wealth and influence, yet always beneath a crown forever beyond their reach. That monarchs created these children and then employed them as instruments of governance reveals one of the colder, more pragmatic aspects of medieval monarchy, a system where dynastic survival outweighed personal bonds. The existence of these individuals shows how medieval power could bend family structures and succession laws to suit political needs. Your attention now turns to a darker and far more controversial aspect of noble authority, one that has sparked debate and fascination for centuries: the so-called Lord's right. This idea conjures an image of unchecked feudal dominance, suggesting a sexual privilege that would represent one of history's most extreme abuses of power. According to legend, this supposed right allowed a feudal lord to claim sexual access to a vassal's bride on her wedding night. The concept has deeply influenced literature, film, and folklore, becoming a lasting symbol of aristocratic cruelty and peasant oppression. It presents a disturbing image of total control over both land and people. Yet the historical reality is far less clear. Despite its prominence in popular imagination, there is little credible evidence that such a practice was ever legally established or widely enforced. No surviving laws or charters explicitly grant this right. Most modern historians now argue that the practice, as commonly imagined, was largely a myth. It likely emerged in later periods, particularly during the French Revolution, as a way to vilify the nobility and legitimize resistance against them. The story endured because it perfectly illustrated the imbalance of power between lord and peasant. It was simple, shocking, and emotionally effective. Much like a modern urban legend, it persisted not because it was true, but because it captured a deeper sense of injustice that people recognized and remembered. A less sensational reality behind the legend. A lesser-known but well-documented practice did exist, where a lord could demand a payment or fine from a newly married couple. In some regions, this payment was called cagium, literally meaning the right of the ass, and it functioned as a fee to waive the lord's symbolic claim over the bride. The couple would pay this fine to gain permission to spend their wedding night together. So rather than a lord arriving with a bottle of wine and a crude smile, he would simply send a tax collector. It is far less theatrical, isn't it? Apologies, but that tax must be settled before you attend to your marital obligations. This was a marriage tax, not an act of sexual violence. It reveals far more about the economic exploitation of peasants than about any strange sexual customs. Scholars continue to debate whether the legend of Droit du Seigneur had roots in an older, harsher, and undocumented practice, or whether it was entirely a later invention created for political reasons. Did the existence of a fee to waive the right hint at a forgotten ancient custom? Or was it merely a clever method for lords to extract money, disguising taxation as ritual? The true answer has been lost over time, but the myth remains a powerful symbol of how absolute royal power was perceived. As you step away from this dark and disputed area of medieval history, it becomes clear that even a king's authority had limits, or at least that those limits were often far more ordinary and financial than popular stories suggest. A king may not have had a right to your bride, but he almost certainly had a claim to a substantial wedding tax. With that, we turn to the more mystical and equally strange methods kings used to ensure the continuation of their bloodline. The debate surrounding the Lord's right shows that not every medieval legend was true. Yet the fear that created these stories was very real, especially the anxiety tied to a king's most important responsibility, producing an heir. When a king's virility appeared to fail, or when a queen remained unable to conceive, prayer alone was often not enough. They turned instead to a confusing mix of fertility rituals and superstitions, blending Christian devotion with lingering pagan traditions that existed just beneath the surface of court life. The widespread use of fertility rituals is a well-established reality of the period. Mainstream historical evidence confirms that medieval kings and queens desperate for a male heir practiced rituals that blurred the line between religion and magic. These acts gave them a sense of control over a situation that felt completely beyond them. They served as spiritual insurance, a desperate effort to convince God, fate, or unseen forces to bless their union. Some of these practices were approved by the church. A royal couple might go on pilgrimage to a shrine dedicated to a fertility-associated saint, such as Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary. They might pray before a specific relic, a bone fragment or cloth believed to possess miraculous power. Other rituals, however, were far less official. They came from whispered folk knowledge shared by court physicians or elderly advisors. A king might be told to touch an ancient stone believed to encourage reproduction or drink from a sacred well, all in hopes of improving fertility. It resembles a very early, very high-stakes belief in lucky charms. One recurring folk belief involved sympathetic magic, where the king and queen consumed foods thought to symbolically represent fertility. A king might eat the testicles of a bull, believing its strength would transfer to him, while a queen might drink rabbit broth, hoping its known fertility would influence her. The logic was simple: if unpleasant, consume a desired quality, and you acquire it. It sounds more like a strange cooking challenge than medicine, but when a dynasty's survival was on the line, nothing was dismissed. Historians still debate how much the church tolerated or even supported these folk practices. Were they sincere expressions of faith, using every possible means? Or were they a way to manage public perception, allowing the church to claim success when an heir was born and assign blame when one was not? The answer is unclear, reflecting how medieval society blended deep pagan traditions with Christian belief. Ultimately, these fertility rituals reveal just how high the stakes were. A king's authority depended on his ability to produce an heir. If that heir did not arrive, no ritual was ignored, no potion refused, and no belief left unexplored. The royal bedchamber became a battleground for the kingdom's future, and the king and queen used every tool available, no matter how unusual. These rituals show not only desperation, but also an early attempt at understanding reproduction through what passed for science at the time. You now enter the royal antechamber, where a learned physician, likely carrying the scent of herbs and strange mixtures, explains the mysteries of the human body. This is the realm of medieval medical theory, where science and superstition often overlapped. The dominant medical model of the era was the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, a system that guided Western medicine for centuries. Historical consensus confirms that medieval physicians believed the body consisted of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. For conception to occur, these humors needed to be perfectly balanced in both partners. If the king's humors were too cold or dry, or the queen's too hot or moist, conception might fail, or result in a female child. This theory placed unusual importance on the sexual act itself. Unlike earlier Greek beliefs that only men produced seed, medieval doctors believed both men and women produced a form of seed necessary for conception. This view was somewhat more equal, but it also placed heavy responsibility on the woman. Physicians believed a woman's orgasm was required to draw the man's seed into the womb. As a result, the queen's satisfaction was not merely personal, it was seen as vital to the future of the kingdom. It was a high-pressure expectation, framed as medical necessity rather than intimacy. Another medical belief held that the best time for conception was immediately after menstruation, when the womb was considered clean and receptive to seed. They would also recommend carefully planned diets for both the king and the queen to bring their humors into the correct balance for conceiving a male child. The king was often advised to consume more foods considered hot and dry, such as spices and red meat, while the queen might be prescribed cold and moist foods like fish and leafy vegetables. In many ways, this resembled a medieval fertility plan, though it placed far greater importance on ensuring the king appeared especially vigorous. Scholars have long debated how often these medical ideas were used to justify royal infidelity. Was it merely coincidence that a king's humoral balance seemed to improve when he was with a mistress, a woman selected for personal attraction rather than political alliance? It is difficult to know for certain, but it is not unreasonable to imagine a physician suggesting that the king's body responded better to a younger, more energetic companion. It served as a convenient medical rationale for an unfaithful gaze, did it not? The medical thinking of the Middle Ages, however unusual it may seem today, reveals that a king's private life was never entirely his own. It was framed as a scientific issue, tied to humors and the hidden workings of the body. His fertility was not confidential, it was openly discussed and medically managed. The king's body functioned as an instrument of state, and physicians acted as technicians attempting to ensure it produced a male heir. When this system appeared to fail, attention often shifted to a more dependable, if unofficial, source of companionship. As the court doctor left the bedchamber after offering his advice on diet and balance, the king was left reflecting on his reproductive prospects. Yet his concerns were not always limited to producing an heir. A king's desires, like those of any man, were complex, and at times they led him toward paths even more discreet and controversial than the presence of a public mistress. This brings us to a rarely addressed aspect of medieval court life, A basic historical reality is that although the church and broader society condemned homosexual behavior, some medieval kings did engage in such relationships. This arrangement often took the form of sexual servitude and was closely tied to low social status and exploitation. Unlike female mistresses, who might secure a recognized position at court, these men lived in unstable and dangerous circumstances. Their survival depended entirely on the king's favor, leaving them vulnerable to dismissal or even execution at the hands of jealous rivals or morally driven nobles. The double standard surrounding these relationships was severe. A king's affair with a female mistress, while criticized, was often tolerated as an unfortunate but natural display of masculinity. By contrast, a sexual relationship with a male concubine was viewed as a serious deviation, a violation of divine and natural law. The political and social consequences were substantial. Such behavior endangered not only the king's soul but also his authority, as enemies could exploit these relationships to discredit his rule or justify rebellion. These arrangements were seldom equal partnerships. The concubine's position relied entirely on royal whim, making daily life a constant negotiation for safety and survival. He was a pawn in the king's political landscape, used when convenient and discarded without protection. He occupied space on the board but held no agency within the game. This situation bore little resemblance to modern ideas of mutual consent. It was a system defined by imbalance, where royal power was absolute and the concubine's autonomy effectively absent. An interesting detail from the period is the use of the term catamite, a derogatory label for a young male concubine, frequently appearing in legal and religious writings to denounce the practice. The word, inherited from ancient Roman usage, indicates that this was not a new phenomenon. It had existed for generations, and the Church had opposed it for just as long. The existence of a specific term underscores that it was a recognized, though deeply condemned, element of medieval society. Historians continue to debate how widespread these practices truly were and whether surviving accounts reflect reality or function as political attacks against disliked rulers. Reconstructing the truth is similar to examining a modern scandal using only hostile sources. Accusations are plentiful, but context and nuance are scarce. Was a king genuinely involved in same-sex relationships, or was he the target of deliberate defamation by rivals seeking to undermine his authority? This question may never be conclusively answered. The concealed history of male concubinage highlights the contradictions of the medieval era, a time when a king's personal conduct was both closely scrutinized and carefully concealed. A monarch was expected to embody religious devotion, yet he was often constrained by his own impulses, which even the powerful church could not always regulate. The rumors of male concubinage and the visible presence of mistresses point to a central tension in medieval society. On one side stood the king, a figure of authority and desire, obligated to produce heirs while also indulging personal appetites. On the other stood the church, an institution with immense influence over beliefs, morals, and souls, including that of the ruler himself. This was a world where strict monastic ideals collided directly with the realities of royal sexuality. The moral framework of the medieval church was uncompromising, a well-established historical fact that shaped everyday life. Sexual activity was regarded as a necessary but regrettable act, acceptable only within marriage and solely for reproduction. Any deviation from this narrow purpose was classified as a grave sin, an offense against God that threatened a king's eternal fate. Practices such as concubinage and adultery were not merely social missteps, they were mortal sins requiring repentance. This created a deep contradiction at the heart of monarchy. The king was meant to serve as a model of faith and virtue, yet his position of power placed him amid constant temptation and entitlement. As a result, many rulers lived divided lives. They spent their days attending religious services and offering prayers, and their nights engaging in relationships condemned by the very doctrines they upheld. The contrast was stark, resembling a modern executive who publicly champions charity while privately committing financial crimes. The two aspects of life existed side by side without resolution. This inner conflict often produced a form of spiritual bargaining. A king, aware of his transgressions, frequently sought redemption through generous gifts and endowments to the church, attempting to balance personal sin with public piety. He might commission the construction of a new monastery, grant vast lands to a cathedral, or finance a new crusade, all in the belief that these good works would outweigh his moral failures. It functioned as a form of spiritual bookkeeping, a way to ensure that his moral ledger showed a positive balance when he eventually stood before God. It was an unusual form of penance. At times, this spiritual negotiation included a king taking a vow of chastity for a limited period, perhaps during Lent or following a particularly sinful episode. This was not about a lifelong promise, but rather a temporary act of purification. The king would refrain from all sexual activity for a fixed number of days or weeks, a symbolic gesture of remorse meant to placate divine judgment. In many ways, it resembled a medieval detox, not of the body, but of the soul. And once the period ended, life typically returned to normal. Historians have long debated whether the Church's moral condemnation stemmed from genuine concern for a king's spiritual well-being or whether it served as a mechanism for political leverage. Did church leaders truly prioritize the salvation of the monarch's soul, or were they primarily interested in keeping him aligned with ecclesiastical interests? By holding kings publicly accountable for their sins, the Church gained significant influence over royal policy and behavior. A king known as a sinner was, by definition, vulnerable, and the Church was willing to exploit that vulnerability when it suited its purposes. The tension between monastic ideals and royal desire reveals that the medieval world was far more complex than it is often portrayed. It was an era marked by contradiction, devotion alongside indulgence, authority paired with submission. A king's sexual behavior was not a purely private concern. It was subject to scrutiny by the Church, judged by God, and believed to shape the fate of his immortal soul. On rare occasions, a king's pursuit of holiness would prevail, though this path was often politically risky and seldom chosen. More commonly, the clash between religious ideals and royal lust resulted in lifelong spiritual negotiation and discreet hypocrisy. Yet in a handful of exceptional and intriguing cases, a king embraced church doctrine with such intensity that it unsettled his entire court. This leads to the remarkable and often politically catastrophic phenomenon of the celibate king. For a monarch, celibacy was never merely a personal or religious choice. It was a deeply political act that directly challenged his most basic responsibility, producing a male heir. The existence of celibate kings is a well-established historical reality, an accepted fact that stands out as a striking anomaly within medieval monarchy. In a system where a king's virility underpinned dynastic survival and national stability, a ruler who abstained from sex represented an ongoing succession crisis. This was not a decision made lightly. It could invite foreign invasion, ignite internal conflict, and ultimately bring an entire royal line to an end. The reasons behind such choices were varied and complex. Some kings appear to have been sincerely devout, valuing their relationship with God above worldly obligations and willingly sacrificing political duty for spiritual assurance. Others may have acted strategically, using celibacy to block rivals' claims or to consolidate authority in unconventional ways. Still others may have been unable, physically or psychologically, to engage in sexual relations, making celibacy a necessity rather than a conscious commitment. It resembles a modern politician campaigning on a platform of refusing all public appearances, both baffling and alarming to observers. A notable example is Edward the Confessor of England, who ruled in the 11th century. Edward took a vow of celibacy and died without heirs, a decision that directly contributed to the succession crisis following his death and ultimately opened the door to the Norman conquest of 1066. While many accounts credit his celibacy to deep personal piety, some historians suspect a political calculation, possibly intended to prevent rivals from inheriting the throne. The question remains unresolved. His most intimate personal decision reshaped the course of English history. Scholars have also questioned whether these supposedly celibate monarchs were truly abstinent, or whether celibacy was a later religious reinterpretation designed to obscure sexual nonconformity, political impotence, or alternative sexual preferences. In several cases, the Church canonized such kings, transforming their lack of heirs into proof of holiness and reframing a political weakness as a spiritual virtue. It resembles a long-running public relations strategy, refined over centuries. Ultimately, celibacy, despite its religious framing, was a fundamentally political choice. A king's body did not belong solely to him, it was considered the body of the state. When a monarch refused to use that body for its expected purpose, he was not merely resisting personal desire. He was challenging the essence of kingship itself. This leads to a central idea of the narrative: the king's body, celibate or otherwise, was always a political instrument. It functioned as a tool of governance, a symbol of authority, and a source of both order and instability. The rare and dangerous decision of a celibate king underscores a core truth of medieval rule. Whether used for reproduction or not, the king's body was never truly private. It was a public symbol upon which the fate of the realm was believed to depend. At the heart of this belief was the concept of the king's body as the state itself, where the monarch's physical condition was seen as a direct reflection of the kingdom's health and prosperity. This idea was central to medieval political thought. Historical consensus confirms that the king's natural body and his political body, the state, were viewed as inseparably connected. His health mirrored the health of the realm. His strength reflected the power of his armies. His virility symbolized the fertility of the land. This near-mystical belief legitimized royal authority and bound the king to the soil he ruled. A sick or impotent king was not simply a weak individual, he was interpreted as evidence of a weakened or cursed kingdom. As a result, his sexual behavior and ability to father children carried divine significance, extending beyond succession to the symbolic well-being of his subjects. In this framework, the king's procreative power was treated almost as a supernatural force. A fertile king promised abundant harvests, thriving livestock, and population growth. An infertile king, by contrast, suggested divine disfavor, a ruler unable to generate life for his people and a potential harbinger of famine or plague. This placed immense pressure on the monarch to be not only a father, but a visibly potent one, a living confirmation of his divine right to rule. It is comparable to a modern corporate leader whose personal life is measured as an official performance indicator, creating an inevitable public relations crisis. A strange and somewhat disturbing idea found in medieval folklore was the belief that a king's masculinity was directly connected to the well-being of his land and animals. According to some stories, if a king was sexually weak or unable to perform, his cattle would stop reproducing, his horses would become crippled, and his crops would fail. His sexual strength was believed to be a kind of mystical energy that flowed through the kingdom itself. It is an odd form of cause and effect. A poor harvest could be explained by rumors of the king's failures in the bedroom. Historians have long debated whether ordinary people truly believed this or whether it was encouraged by the state to reinforce royal authority. Was it a sincere popular belief, or was it carefully promoted by the church and nobility to support the king's position? The most likely answer lies somewhere in between. It was a deeply rooted folk belief that was later adopted and strengthened by those in power. This idea of the king's body representing the state worked in two opposing ways. On one hand, it elevated him, turning him into a living symbol of the nation's strength. On the other hand, it placed him under constant observation. Every illness, every rumor of sexual failure, became a public concern and a supposed indicator of the kingdom's condition. These beliefs could even be used to justify removing him from power or ending his life. A king perceived as impotent was viewed as a threat to the state, someone who had failed at his most essential responsibility. In this sense, the king's body did not truly belong to him. It was a symbol, a political tool, and a public display of authority and virility. As we will see, this belief in the king's powerful and almost divine body also led to a troubling sense of legal and moral immunity. Kings were often treated as being above the laws that governed everyone else, particularly when it came to sexual behavior. The notion that the king's body reflected the health of the state gave him near godlike status. His physical existence became proof of his divine right to rule, and this belief encouraged many kings to see themselves as exempt from ordinary laws. This leads to a darker reality of medieval rule. sexual crimes protected by royal privilege. A king's authority often allowed him to ignore or manipulate laws related to sexual misconduct without consequence. Royal privilege was a basic feature of medieval governance. Historical records confirm that the king was frequently regarded as the source of all law and therefore not subject to it. He embodied the law and could reshape it as he wished. This created a harsh and unequal legal system. While a common person could face execution for adultery, a king could openly keep multiple mistresses or concubines without fear of punishment. This immunity was rarely written down, but it was widely understood. Because of this protection, kings could commit acts that would be considered serious crimes for anyone else. Historical accounts describe kings forcing themselves on women at court or taking peasant women from their homes, with little possibility of resistance. The king's command was law, and opposing him was treated as opposing the state. Victims had no legal protection, no court to turn to, and no hope of justice. Their suffering was often reduced to a minor detail in the story of a ruler's reign. Some chronicles describe a particularly revealing legal tactic: the king's ability to declare his actions lawful simply by royal order. Through official decree, he could invent legal justifications that erased any accusation. For example, he might claim that a woman he assaulted was actually a concubine, framing the act as royal authority rather than a crime. This manipulation of the law shows that royal power was not only physical but also intellectual. The king had the ability to define reality itself. It resembles a modern leader denying wrongdoing and then using authority to silence any challenge. Historians continue to debate how much control the church or nobility truly had over a cruel or abusive king. Could they stop him, or were they helpless against someone who believed himself divinely appointed? While the church could excommunicate a ruler and nobles could rebel, these actions were extreme and driven more by politics than by justice. A sinful king was seen as a political issue, not a legal one. And a king who was powerful enough often faced no challenge at all. This belief in divine authority overriding human law remains one of the most unsettling aspects of medieval monarchy. It granted kings an extraordinary freedom to act without fear of punishment. However, even this freedom had limits. A king's sexual life, no matter how private or scandalous, was never entirely his own. It was closely watched by the court and monitored by the church. Although the king enjoyed legal protection for his worst behaviors, his personal life was still a matter of public interest. This became especially clear during one specific event, the royal wedding night. Here we enter one of the most uncomfortable customs of the medieval world, the public consummation of an arranged marriage. This ritual transformed an intimate moment into a formal display, deeply humiliating for the bride and politically critical for the kingdom. Arranged marriage was a basic reality of medieval royalty. Historical evidence confirms that royal unions were about power, alliances, and bloodlines, not affection. A princess was a strategic asset in European politics, and her body was central to that value. As a result, the completion of the marriage was not a private act. It was a public confirmation of a political agreement. To guarantee this agreement, the couple often took part in a bedding ceremony. High-ranking nobles, clergy members, and relatives would gather in the bedchamber to witness the beginning of the wedding night. This was not a celebration but a formal requirement meant to ensure the marriage was valid under both religious and state law. The king and queen would be escorted to the bed, undressed, and placed beneath the covers while the witnesses observed. The most invasive part of this ritual came the next morning. After the witnesses left the couple alone, they would return at dawn to examine the bedsheets. They searched for blood as proof of the bride's virginity and confirmation that the marriage had been physically completed. If blood was found, the marriage was officially recognized, and the witnesses would mark the occasion with food and drink. If no blood was discovered, the consequences could be severe. It might trigger a public scandal, create a crisis over succession, and even result in the annulment of the marriage. In many ways, it resembled an extremely high-stakes wedding toast, except with far greater pressure and absolutely no celebration. One notable exception to the traditional bedding ceremony occurred when a king married a woman who was already pregnant. If a ruler, for example, had a mistress carrying his child, he might choose to marry her but skip the bedding ceremony entirely. This approach avoided the public display of consummation and demonstrated that even within a rigid system of tradition, a king could occasionally bend the rules to suit his needs. Historians have long debated how common these public rituals truly were. Were they performed in every royal marriage, or were they mainly used as a tool to pressure unwilling couples into consummation? Were such ceremonies a universal custom, or an extreme measure reserved for moments of political necessity? The answer remains unclear. However, their very existence reveals an important truth. A king's private life, even its most intimate aspects, was never fully his own. The consummation of an arranged royal marriage was a strange and often harsh ritual. It represented deep humiliation for the bride and carried enormous political weight for the realm. It was a moment when royal authority was openly displayed, yet also a time when the king's personal life was examined more closely than ever. Even a ruler who believed himself above the law was still constrained by the strict traditions of his era. The public exposure of a royal wedding night was treated with immense solemnity. It was a moment when a king's private actions were scrutinized for the perceived good of the state. Yet amid this heavy atmosphere, there was one figure who could disrupt the seriousness with a timely joke, a crude rhyme, or sharp satire. This figure was the jester or court fool. Despite his foolish appearance, he played a unique and essential role in the royal court, particularly concerning matters of sexuality and taboo. The jester's role was a fundamental aspect of medieval court life. Historical evidence confirms that he was far more than a simple entertainer. He acted as a social critic and satirist, and he alone possessed permission to speak openly to power. He could mock the king, the queen, ministers, and generals without punishment. This unusual freedom allowed him to address subjects others avoided, especially those involving the king's personal conduct. Nowhere was this freedom more evident than in sexual humor. The jester was often the only person who could openly joke about the king's desires, his failure to produce an heir, or his many mistresses without fear. He might perform a bawdy song about royal virility or deliver a crude joke about the queen's infertility, and the court, despite its formality, was expected to laugh. This humor acted as a social release, allowing tension and anxiety to be expressed safely. In many ways, it functioned like an early version of a late-night satirist, though with far greater personal risk if boundaries were crossed. An interesting feature of the jester's performance was his use of props. His staff, or merit, was typically a small stick topped with a carved head wearing a fool's cap. While it symbolized his office, it was often used in suggestive or symbolic ways. The jester might strike someone lightly with it or gesture with it in a manner that hinted at sexual meaning. This visual humor reinforced both his role and his freedom to be irreverent and provocative. Scholars continue to debate whether the jester's humor functioned primarily as social control, allowing nobles and commoners alike to release frustration without real consequence, or whether it served as genuine commentary that influenced royal behavior. Was it merely a way to reduce pressure, or a subtle means of guiding the king? The answer remains uncertain, reflecting the ambiguous nature of the jester's role. The jester's sexual satire shows that even the most structured societies left space for mockery and challenge. Although the king symbolized the state itself, he was still human, with all the weaknesses that entailed. The jester's task was to remind him of this reality, using humor to puncture royal seriousness and bring him back to earth. This was perhaps the jester's most important duty, carried out with wit that was often crude but highly effective. Jokes about a king's sexual ability would not have been harmless. For a ruler whose virility was tied directly to national stability, such humor likely struck at a deep fear, impotence, and the collapse of his dynasty. Faced with this anxiety, kings often sought concrete and sometimes strange solutions, aphrodisiacs and potions. Medieval courts were filled with unusual remedies, resembling an early form of sexual medicine shaped by folklore and belief. Faith in aphrodisiacs was widespread during the period. Historical records show that kings and their physicians relied on many odd substances to improve sexual performance and, more importantly, fertility. These treatments were not about pleasure alone. They were considered medical necessities, essential to securing the future of the ruling line. A sexually capable king was believed to be a strong ruler, and a strong ruler was expected to enjoy a long and successful reign. As a result, the ingredients used in these mixtures were often rare and bizarre. Powdered rhinoceros horn was thought to transfer strength and vitality, while crushed lizard tails symbolized regeneration. Exotic spices like cinnamon and ginger were used to warm the body and stimulate circulation. Herbs such as ginseng and saffron were valued for their energizing effects. It resembled a medieval cooking process, though with unusual components and far greater consequences. These potions were prepared by royal physicians and, at times, alchemists or other court specialists. They occupied a strange space between medical expert, magician, and fraud. Their advice blended medical theory, folklore, and hope. A doctor might claim the king's bodily humors were unbalanced and prescribe a mixture of powdered pearl and herbs to restore virility. The king would consume it, trusting the remedy, never knowing whether success came from the ingredients themselves or from belief alone. A curious recipe found in several medieval texts describes a form of love potion or aphrodisiac made from powdered pearl, dried bat's blood, and a particular herb. The mixture had to be consumed at a precise time, either during the day or night. It was believed to enhance a king's virility and make him especially attractive to women. In many ways, it resembles a medieval version of modern dating tools, except it involved unusual animal ingredients and a very real risk of poisoning. By comparison, modern romantic challenges seem relatively simple. Scholars have long debated whether these potions had any real effect. Were they producing a placebo response, a genuine physical reaction, or were they simply ineffective altogether? While some of the herbs included did possess mild medicinal qualities, most components were symbolic rather than functional. The real strength of these potions lay in belief. They represented a king asserting control over his body and destiny. The use of aphrodisiacs reveals that a king's private life was never entirely personal. It was a matter of governance, overseen by physicians and weighed heavily on his conscience. A king seen as sexually capable was also viewed as politically strong, while one who was not faced serious danger. In moments of desperation, kings often turned to methods they believed to be more dependable, though far less accepted, to secure their lineage, methods often stranger and more hazardous than any potion. The intense pressure to produce an heir pushed some kings toward bizarre treatments and questionable cures. When those failed, some resorted to practices that crossed a universal boundary. At this point, we enter the hidden history of royal incest and forbidden customs. This practice was as disturbing to medieval society as it is today, yet on rare occasions it was justified for one alarming purpose: preserving the perceived purity of royal blood. Royal incest was never common, but it remains a grim historical reality. Established historical records show that in certain royal families, especially during the later medieval period, marriages between close relatives, such as cousins or nieces, did occur. The reasoning behind this was complex and deeply tied to royal ideology. Royal blood was considered sacred and divinely favored, and marriage outside the family was thought to corrupt it. Keeping marriages within the lineage was seen as a way to protect the throne and maintain legitimacy. This strategy also served political ends. By marrying relatives, kings reduced the risk of rival claims through marriage alliances. It functioned as a form of political isolation, ensuring the dynasty remained sealed from outside influence. The consequences were often severe. Inbreeding led to genetic conditions, physical abnormalities, and mental instability, and was frequently viewed as evidence of a declining dynasty. It resembles a family so determined to preserve control that it ultimately causes itself harm. One notable example is the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled large parts of Europe for centuries. Although the most famous cases occurred later, their tradition of marrying close relatives began in the medieval period. The results included inherited traits such as a protruding jaw and high infant mortality rates. This serves as a reminder that regardless of royal status, biological laws still applied. Historians have long debated whether royal incest was driven by political necessity or represented moral and religious distortion. Did monarchs truly believe they were safeguarding a divine bloodline, or were they exploiting taboo practices for power? The answer remains unclear, reflecting how royal motivations often blended faith, politics, and personal ambition. These practices demonstrate how a king's desperation for an heir could push him toward dangerous decisions. He risked family health, dynastic stability, and church condemnation in pursuit of a bloodline that was likely more myth than reality. This highlights that royal authority extended beyond politics into religious and moral illusion. This leads to another form of royal desperation, one far more common and publicly visible. When a king failed to produce an heir with his wife, he often sought a solution through the church, separation, or more precisely, annulment. As we will see, a monarch's desire for a new queen could pressure church law in ways that were both clever and unusual. While incest and rituals marked the darker extremes of desperation, annulment offered a more socially acceptable route. In a medieval world dominated divorce, as understood today, was almost entirely forbidden. However, annulment provided a loophole. An annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid. To obtain one, a king had to argue that the union was flawed from the beginning, allowing him to remarry without violating religious law. The reasons used were often complex or unusual. A king might claim the marriage was never consummated, a charge difficult to verify. Another argument involved close kinship, even if a previous dispensation had allowed the marriage. In such cases, the king would request that the pope reverse his own approval, a bold move that often succeeded due to royal influence. This amounted to a form of legal pressure, where power forced religious authority to bend. It mirrors a modern executive demanding rule changes to suit personal needs. Another justification sometimes offered was that the king suffered from an illness or curse preventing consummation. This often indirectly blamed the queen, suggesting infertility or supernatural interference. Claims of witchcraft or divine punishment were occasionally raised, and the church frequently considered them seriously. In effect, it was a medieval version of shifting blame, framed through theology rather than emotion. Scholars continue to question whether the church acted as an independent moral force or functioned largely as an extension of political authority in such cases. Was the Pope genuinely concerned with protecting the sanctity of a king's marriage, or was he more anxious about the political and financial risks of offending a powerful ruler? The answer, as expected, depended on both the Pope and the monarch involved. At times, the Pope resisted royal pressure; at other moments, he yielded. The history of divorces and annulments reveals a pattern shaped by royal authority and ecclesiastical vulnerability. It is the story of a king who, desperate for an heir, was prepared to use every available instrument, including the church's own laws, to achieve his goal. It demonstrates that royal power extended beyond politics and warfare. It also carried legal and spiritual weight, the ability to influence and reshape the rules governing the world he ruled. This leads us to a different form of royal education, one far more practical than many might expect. A young prince, aware that his future depended heavily on producing an heir, was prepared early for the physical expectations of kingship. His training did not stop at warfare or governance. It also included preparation for the bedchamber. As we will see, this instruction was both comprehensive and, by modern standards, unusual. A king's capacity to pressure the church into granting an annulment highlights just how critical the issue of succession was. For that reason, a prince was trained not only to command armies or wield weapons, but also to understand the most personal aspects of his future responsibilities. We now step into the private study of a young prince, where a tutor delivers a highly practical form of instruction, one rooted as much in statecraft as in the physical realities of marriage. The education of a prince was a core principle of medieval society. Established historical evidence shows that his training was designed to prepare him for every element of his future role, including his foremost duty, producing an heir. His studies were not limited to Latin or military tactics. They also included direct, often clinical lessons about his own body, a woman's body, and the process of conception. The aim was clear. When the time came to consummate his marriage, he would be prepared, confident, and capable of fulfilling his obligation. By modern standards, the methods used were unusual. A trusted physician might provide formal instruction, explaining contemporary theories of reproduction and how balancing bodily humors was believed to influence the likelihood of producing a male heir. In some cases, the prince might also receive practical experience, arranged discreetly with a servant or courtesan bound by secrecy. This was considered a legitimate form of royal preparation, intended to ensure the prince would not enter marriage inexperienced or face embarrassment due to ignorance. It was, in effect, a high-stakes form of training, less about personal desire and more about securing a dynasty. Another common feature of this education involved prescribed diets and tonics meant to improve the prince's vitality. Physicians might recommend specific meats or wines, believing these would enhance potency. The prince was taught that his body represented the health of the kingdom itself, and that his physical vigor reflected his future success as a ruler. In many ways, it resembled a medieval approach to physical optimization, framed through the language of humors rather than modern science. Scholars have long debated how effective these practices truly were, and whether their primary purpose was physical preparation or psychological conditioning. Were they meant to make the prince skilled in intimacy, or to ensure he was confident, composed, and socially secure in his role? The most likely answer lies somewhere in between. This education combined practical instruction with mental preparation. It reinforced the idea that a king's body did not belong solely to himself. It was a matter of public concern. His sexuality was not private, it was political. From a young age, a prince was taught that his body was an instrument of the state, to be managed for the good of the realm. This perspective stands in sharp contrast to the romantic ideals that flourished at the same time, particularly the culture of chivalry and courtly love. A king's practical training in the bedchamber often conflicted with these ideals, which celebrated emotional devotion rather than procreation. While the prince's private education emphasized fertility, duty, and bodily balance, the public life of the court offered a very different lesson. Here, poets and troubadours promoted an idealized vision of love, one defined by restraint, admiration from afar, and emotional purity. Courtly love was a central theme of medieval literature and a well-established historical phenomenon. It functioned as a social and literary convention, where a knight pledged loyalty to a noblewoman, often married, and drew inspiration from this unattainable affection. This love was not intended to result in physical union. Instead, it served as a source of moral and emotional motivation. While beautiful in theory, it stood in direct opposition to the practical realities faced by kings. This contradiction created deep tension in royal life. On one side, the king was expected to act pragmatically, marrying for alliances and engaging in intimacy for the sake of heirs. On the other, he was expected to participate in the rituals of romance, composing poetry and performing devotion in line with courtly ideals. Balancing these opposing expectations often resulted in hypocrisy and complex social maneuvering. It resembles the modern expectation that leaders be both hard-edged realists and charming public figures at the same time. One symbolic element frequently used in this romantic tradition was the ring. A knight might present a ring to his lady as a sign of loyalty, and she would wear it to acknowledge his devotion. Yet this gesture carried no legal or marital meaning. It was not a wedding ring, but a symbol within a carefully maintained social performance. It symbolized a love outside marriage, a connection that was both spiritual and physical, yet rarely consummated. Courtly love acted as a kind of romantic code, allowing individuals to pursue affection without openly defying the rules of the church. Historians have long debated whether courtly love was a genuine practice or simply a literary invention. Did kings truly embody these ideals, or was it merely a pastime, a way to escape the harsh realities of their lives? The answer remains unclear, reflecting the complex balance between duty and desire in a king's life. Courtly love profoundly influenced royal relationships. It gave kings a socially acceptable way to express devotion to their mistresses, romanticize their affairs, and justify infidelity. The mistress became more than a source of pleasure, She was a muse, inspiring kings to artistic or heroic endeavors. This romanticized ideal sharply contrasted with the king's wife, who was often treated as a political asset rather than a partner in love. The story of courtly love highlights the duality in a king's life, a man expected to be both pragmatic and romantic, warrior and poet. It reveals that kings were not only figures of power and duty but also subjects of love, desire, and human vulnerability. However, this romantic world had a darker side. A king's sexual indulgences often brought him into contact with venereal diseases. Beneath the chivalry and idealized courtly romance lay a harsher reality. Mistresses, concubines, and a lack of medical knowledge frequently exposed kings to infections. This hidden history of venereal disease, silent and devastating, could threaten not only the king's health but also that of his entire court. Venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were indeed present in medieval Europe, even if poorly understood. Spread through sexual networks, they could pass from mistresses to concubines, from the queen to children, creating fear and anxiety that could rarely be openly addressed. Syphilis, in particular, caused painful sores, disfigurement, and mental deterioration. A king suffering from such illnesses faced immense physical and psychological agony, a stark reminder that his body, while symbolic of his kingdom, was fragile and mortal. The effects on the court were equally significant. A queen could be blamed for miscarriages, infertility, or frailty, while the king, protected by divine right, escaped scrutiny. Remedies often involved alchemy or dangerous treatments with mercury, which sometimes worsened the condition rather than curing it, a grim reflection of medieval medicine's limitations. Historical scholars have also speculated that venereal diseases contributed to the decline of certain royal dynasties. A king slowly succumbing to illness could make poor decisions, destabilizing his kingdom. These hidden illnesses reveal that royal indulgence was not just a source of pleasure but also of danger, suffering, and fear. This brings us to another striking aspect of medieval kingship, the king's bedchamber, both private and profoundly public. Despite its intimacy, it functioned as a political stage. A king's health and body symbolized more than personal well-being, they were matters of state. Medieval rituals like the lever and coucher, morning and evening ceremonies, were attended by nobles, ministers, and dignitaries who witnessed the king's dressing and undressing. These events were not mere pageantry, they were politically significant. Access to the bedchamber indicated favor, while exclusion marked disfavor. In this way, the king's most personal space became a site of power negotiation and political visibility, a public theater where proximity to the sovereign measured influence. The bedchamber, like the king himself, was both intimate and symbolic, a place where romance, duty, health, and politics intersected in medieval courts. A fascinating aspect of the royal bedchamber is the role of the valet, a personal attendant who occupied a uniquely intimate position with the king. Despite his low rank, the valet wielded considerable influence. He had access to the king's most private moments, thoughts, and fears, acting as a trusted confidant who could speak truth to power without fear of reprisal. In many ways, he served as a secret advisor, often holding more sway over the king than a duke or cardinal. Historians have long debated whether the elaborate rituals surrounding the king's daily life were genuine displays of royal authority or subtle forms of psychological control designed to constantly remind the monarch of his public role. Was the king a willing participant in these public performances, or a prisoner in his own bedchamber, never truly alone? Likely, it was both. A monarch who embodied power yet was constrained by the very symbols of that power. The bedchamber, though private, functioned as a public stage. The king's body symbolized his kingdom, and his life, however intimate, was a performance of authority and duty. This context gives rise to a unique form of royal record, far more candid, and often scandalous, than any official chronicle. The private moments within the king's bedchamber were frequently the source of courtly gossip, an informal, unwritten history shared among the nobles. Beyond political rituals and scrutiny, the bedchamber was a breeding ground for gossip. The whispers of the court about the king's health, virility, mistresses, and favorites formed an undercurrent to official affairs. These rumors were sometimes documented by medieval chroniclers, often monks or court officials, who acted as early tabloids. While their main task was to record official history, they did not shy away from including scandalous tales, rumors of queens' alleged affairs, kings' impotence, or princes' sexual deviance. Though often moralized, these chronicles combined official events with gossip, creating a hybrid of history and historical fiction. Compelling, sometimes unreliable but always revealing. A prime example is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, while largely factual, occasionally includes juicy rumors, such as a queen accused of poisoning her husband, a claim never proven but rife with political intrigue. Such records demonstrate that even formal historical accounts could not resist the allure of scandal. Scholars continue to grapple with these sources, questioning how to separate fact from fiction. While we cannot accept every rumor as truth, we also cannot ignore their existence or their impact on the people involved. The interplay of gossip and chroniclers reveals a king whose life was never entirely his own. His private moments were publicly scrutinized, and intimate secrets often became part of the historical record. This dynamic also influenced royal punishment. A queen accused of adultery, for example, could face brutal, public shaming, a direct consequence of court gossip and the king's authority. A rumor could escalate into a scandal, and scandal could result in swift, harsh consequences. For a king, such scandals were an annoyance. For a queen or mistress, they could be fatal. This highlights the deeply gendered double standard of medieval justice. Adultery by a king was tolerated, often expected, but for a queen or noblewoman, it was a capital offense. It was not merely a personal betrayal but a political crime, threatening the royal bloodline, succession, and the kingdom's stability. A queen's body represented her kingdom's purity, and even a single act of infidelity could destroy her life. Punishments for adultery were often extreme and public. A guilty queen might be imprisoned, exiled, or executed, and Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, being the most famous example. Even lesser noblewomen faced harsh public humiliation, such as whipping or parading through town with a sign marking their shame. Some kings opted for exile over execution, sending their wives to nunneries or remote castles, a quieter, yet lifelong punishment, separating them from family, children, and court. Historians debate whether these measures were truly deterrents or tools to remove politically inconvenient queens. Did a king, notorious for his affairs with his own mistresses, truly care about his queen's fidelity? Or was accusations of adultery merely a pretext to replace her with someone else? The truth is unclear, but it's not hard to imagine a politically savvy king exploiting adultery charges to achieve his own goals. The harsh punishments for adultery demonstrate that a king's authority extended beyond politics or the battlefield. He held moral and legal power. He could make laws, enforce them, and destroy lives for those who opposed him. This reveals a complex royal ideal, one that inspired loyalty yet embodied deep hypocrisy. The Church's cult of the Virgin Mary set an impossible standard of purity for royal women, standards that kings often disregarded themselves. Adultery punishments highlight this contradiction. A king had freedom, while a queen's body represented the kingdom's honor. Purity was both political and religious, enforced as an ideal for every woman in the court. The Virgin Mary's cult was central to high medieval thought. Mary was more than a saint, she was a revered spiritual queen, embodying both virginity and motherhood. For royal women, especially queens, this ideal imposed a dual expectation: be fertile to produce heirs, yet remain a pure, saintly figure. The queen's role became a paradox. She was a wife and mother, yet also a living symbol of divine chastity. Queens were often described as mirrors of the Virgin Mary, elevating their status but intensifying their pressure to embody perfection. This dual expectation, a mother and a virgin, was an impossible burden, reminiscent of modern celebrities expected to be both role models and sex symbols, but framed in religious terms rather than media attention. Scholars debate whether the cult of Mary genuinely elevated women or functioned as a form of control, reinforcing male dominance. Likely, it was both, a powerful religious ideal serving political and pious purposes. The story of the Virgin Mary's cult also exposes royal hypocrisy. Kings were expected to honor Mary's ideals while frequently violating them themselves, demonstrating that royal life encompassed both duty and moral contradiction. This tension extended into other royal rituals, such as hunting. A king's passion for the hunt was not merely a pastime. It symbolized power, masculinity, and sometimes sexuality. The queen's impossible standard of purity contrasted with the king's public projection of vigor and dominance, expressed in fields and forests. Hunting became a metaphorical stage for demonstrating masculine power and sexual authority. Hunting was more than sport, it was political, social, and cultural theater. A skilled hunter symbolized a skilled warrior and a ruler in control of his realm. Sexual metaphors were embedded in the hunt. Chasing, capturing, and killing animals often mirrored symbolic conquest, representing male virility and dominance. The stag, with its antlers, represented potency. The boar, with its strength, symbolized raw power. Killing them was a display of mastery over these qualities, a public affirmation of the king's might and virility. A ritual often followed the kill. The king would present an animal's heart or liver to the queen or a lady of the court. This gesture was more than a trophy, it was a symbolic offering of power and conquest, a declaration of dominance in both political and sexual terms. It shows that hunting was entwined with complex displays of authority, desire, and ritualized courtship, far different from modern ideas of sport or romance. Historians continue to debate whether kings consciously used these sexual metaphors or if they are a modern interpretation of older, primal rituals. Either way, the hunt illustrates how medieval monarchy intertwined power, sexuality, and symbolism, revealing the elaborate and often contradictory expectations placed on kings and queens alike. Did a king who hunted stags actually see women in his prey, or was he simply a man with a passion for hunting? The truth is unclear, but it is plausible to imagine a king who used the hunt as a metaphor, a way to project strength, dominance, and masculinity that he might have lacked in private life. Hunting as a sexual metaphor reveals the contradictions in a king's life, expected to be a devout Christian, yet often a master of symbolic sexual conquest. A king's existence was not only about power and duty, it was also about asserting a primal, symbolic masculinity as integral to his identity as his crown and scepter. This brings us to a striking and unusual example of royal sexuality, a king who defied social norms and became legendary for it. The hunting metaphors, as we have noted, were one way for a king to display masculinity and authority. Yet some kings took a different route, rejecting tradition and challenging the expectations of their office entirely. One such example is King Edward II of England, whose intimate relationships with male favorites, especially Piers Gaveston, became notorious political scandals. Edward's bonds with Gaveston were not merely personal, they were inherently political, and they eventually contributed to his downfall. He showered Gaveston with wealth, titles, and power, elevating him to the role of Earl, effectively making him the kingdom's second-in-command. This favoritism stirred resentment among the nobility, not only over the king's private preferences but also over perceived injustice. A king who elevated a commoner with no noble lineage was seen as a threat to the realm. The role of Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, adds another dimension. Initially a pawn in political machinations, she married a man who showed her little interest. Over time, however, Isabella became the leader of a rebellion against Edward, fueled by his neglect and favoritism. With the support of the nobles, she invaded England, deposed her husband, and placed their son, Edward III, on the throne. This illustrates that a king's private life was never truly private, and that a seemingly powerless queen could still wield extraordinary political influence. An interesting detail about Gaveston is that he was exiled multiple times, yet Edward repeatedly found ways to return him to power. On one occasion, when nobles forced Gaveston's exile, Edward appointed him as his representative in Ireland, a move that defied the nobility and reasserted royal authority. It's comparable to a modern leader being forced to fire a chief of staff, only to assign them a more influential position abroad. This defiance was audacious but ultimately self-destructive. Historians have long debated whether Edward II's sexuality alone caused his downfall or if it reflected a deeper political crisis. Was he a weak king undone by personal desires, or a monarch caught in the crossfire of a powerful nobility seeking an excuse to depose him? The answer is likely both. Edward II's story demonstrates how a king's private life could become a matter of political consequence, capable of shaping the fate of a kingdom. Beyond politics, a king's sexuality held a mystical and symbolic dimension. In medieval belief, a king's virility was tied to the prosperity of the land itself. A potent and capable king symbolized abundance, healthy crops, thriving livestock, and population growth, while an impotent ruler signaled famine, plague, and decay. The king's body became a metaphorical garden, and his ability to produce an heir was seen as essential to the fertility and well-being of the kingdom. This connection was reinforced through rituals and folklore. One example is the sacred marriage, a practice that combined pagan and Christian traditions, in which a king's union was perceived as merging him with the land itself. In this sense, marriage was almost magical, ensuring the kingdom's fertility and prosperity. It was a medieval equivalent of a farmer's almanac, but instead of relying on celestial signs, the king's sexual vigor determined the health of the land. Some stories went further, suggesting that an impotent king would doom his livestock to sterility, weaken his horses, and render his fields barren. The king's sexual vitality was long regarded as a kind of magical force that influenced the land. It's an unusual cause and effect belief. Poor harvests might be blamed on the king's performance in the bedchamber. Scholars have debated whether these ideas were genuinely held by the populace or were tools to keep the monarch aware of his public role. Were they grassroots beliefs, or clever mechanisms used by the church and nobility to control the king? The answer is likely a combination of both, deeply rooted folk traditions skillfully leveraged by those in power. Ultimately, the king's body was never entirely his own. It was a symbol, a tool, a public performance of power and virility. A king's life, even in its most intimate moments, was a performance of authority and responsibility. This context leads us to a unique form of royal tragedy, directly tied to a king's power and sexual practices. The unusual and often tragic role of eunuchs in the royal court stemmed from this very desire for control. A king's virility was considered a source of magical power, bringing fertility and prosperity to his realm. Yet, with this power came anxiety, fear of betrayal, and a drive for absolute control. Sometimes, this drive manifested in extreme ways, such as the presence of eunuchs in court. Eunuchs, men castrated as children, lived lives of both privilege and profound trauma. Their existence in royal courts reflected a king's desire for a type of sexual control that was complete and, in many ways, tragic. Historical records confirm that in societies where the king's power was absolute, his desire to control his household, his queen, and his court could be just as total. Eunuchs were considered the ideal solution, loyal attendants who posed no sexual threat and could be trusted with the women of the court. This arrangement allowed the king to mitigate risks of sexual impropriety or illegitimate heirs, a high-stakes form of trust, enforced with brutal methods. The reality of a eunuch's life was a complex mixture of authority and vulnerability. While they could hold positions of influence, advisors, confidants, even military leaders, they were also permanently deprived of traditional manhood. They could not father children, yet they often oversaw the king's heirs. They could not engage in sexual relations, yet they were responsible for the women of the court. It was a life defined by cruel irony, both privileged and constrained. Their perceived lack of sexuality was believed to make them more loyal. The king could entrust eunuchs with intimate secrets, knowing they would never become rivals. In this sense, eunuchs were simultaneously inside and outside the royal family, a living paradox. Historians continue to debate whether the employment of eunuchs reflected a king's genuine desire for control or was largely performative, a demonstration of power. Was the king truly concerned with fidelity, or was this a ritualized expression of authority? Likely, it was both, a complex mix of personal anxiety and political theater. The story of eunuchs illustrates that a king's power extended far beyond politics or military might. It encompassed sexual and moral authority, shaping the lives of those around him. The tragic tale of eunuchs and a king's drive for total control underscores a central truth. A monarch's private life was a public spectacle, filled with potential scandal and political intrigue. Every aspect of his life, from marriage to private chambers, was a performance of power and duty. Ultimately, a king's perceived virility, authority, and the throne itself were inseparable. The belief in his sexual potency as a divine gift was a core principle of medieval monarchy. Historical evidence confirms that a king's ability to produce an heir was not merely personal, it was a foundational aspect of his power. It was a supernatural force, a sacred fire that had to be maintained for the kingdom's well-being. This fire symbolized the foundation of his right to rule, an essential part of his kingship. Without it, he was seen as a ruler who had failed his most basic duty, a king who had lost his divine authority. This belief in the king's potency drove all the unusual practices of the time. The urgent need for a male heir pushed him into strange rituals, from praying to saints to consuming mysterious potions. The pressure to demonstrate his virility led him to take mistresses and concubines, engage in adulterous affairs, and even use the hunt as a metaphor for sexual power. The king's body was considered a garden, with his sexual energy as the sun and rain that nourished it. Without it, the garden would wither. Folklore of the period often described a king's potency as a spiritual well, a sacred source of water that flowed through the kingdom, ensuring rivers ran, crops grew, and people thrived. An impotent king was a well that had run dry, unable to sustain life in his realm. A terrifying idea, a spiritual and political death far worse than physical death. In this context, the king's sexuality was literally a source of life. Scholars have long debated whether this focus on potency reflected genuine belief or social construction, a tool to legitimize male power within a patriarchal system. Was it a real fear or a form of political theater designed to show the king as worthy of his throne? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. A deeply held folk belief skillfully amplified by those in power. The story of a king's This was the burden of kingship, a life of privilege shadowed by intense psychological and physical pressure. In a very real sense, the king was a slave to his own potency. As the king's bedchamber, long a stage of power and intrigue, falls silent, the faint echoes of history whisper through time. They remind us that a king's life was never truly his own. His body, his desires, and his most private moments were part of a larger, more intricate story, written not only in the chronicles but in the very fabric of his kingdom. The oil lamp now glows faintly, and the cicadas outside settle into a gentle hum. You have journeyed through societal norms, ingenious practicalities, medical theories, and quiet solidarities of a long-gone world. Their struggles with discomfort, pursuit of hygiene, silent endurance, and connection to nature reveal resilience and resourcefulness. Even the most private aspects of life carry historical weight,